All right.
So far, so good.
Everyone, I am delighted to be here. I'm John Merck. I'm the Undergraduate Director of the Department of Geology at University of Maryland College Park. And I did my PhD dissertation on the linguistic relationships of marine reptiles and Subtil. I am a planist, and so I know a decent amount about vertebrate evolution. I do not know about the things you know about. The identification of fossil vertebrate specimens. Probably everyone in this room is better at that than I am. This gentleman pulled out some vertebrae, and I was able to say snake. All right, that's about as far as I can take it. What I'd like to do, though, is share with you some observations about my personal view of the growing debate about what snakes are. That is to say, where they fit in the tree of evolution. And I like the metaphor that snakes are more subtle than bees because they really sort of are. So here's the quote from the King James Bible: "Serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made." And those subtleties sort of express themselves in two basic ways. First of all, how is this even possible? All right? How does a limbless animal locomote on land? But the second is, what is a snake actually? Where does it fit into the tree of vertebrate evolution? And it turns out that first question is really crazy easy to answer. The second one is proving to be diabolically difficult. And although we are approaching the consensus, we are not altogether there. I'm just curious to know, looking at my audience, by the way, how many of you are avocational herpetologists? One, two, okay. How many of you are primarily avocational paleontologists and fossil club? Okay, there's some overlap, I see. All right, thank you. If I start spending my wheels talking about stuff you're all familiar with, please kick me out of my rut, all right? I do not mind being interrupted. But if I blast through things that make it seem enigmatic that I need to spend a little bit more time on, let me know about that too. Okay, so first, let's just wrap our brains around serpentine locomotion, just so we're all on the same page. There are tons and tons of vertebrates that locomote by means of axial movement of their vertebral column. And the vast majority of them are called fish. Okay? This is a standard form of aquatic locomotion in vertebrates. This eel is a particularly colorful and vivid example. How does that translate onto land, though? Okay? Because what's going on here in the water is that the eel is throwing successive S-shaped waves down its body, and as they propagate downwards, they push against the water that's surrounding the animal, and as a direct and opposite reaction, the fish moves forward. Well, it's actually surprisingly many land vertebrates retain some element of axial locomotion in their movement on land. So here's a monitor lizard, and yeah, it's striding, moving its hands and feet, but it is also undulating its vertebral column in order to increase the length of its stride. And that's a motion that can be exploited by creatures that find themselves in a particular type of situation logically. Suppose that you are a small tetrapod who has to negotiate some sort of cluttered environment, maybe leaf litter or rock piles, or actually burrowing in the soil. In that case, your limbs can actually become impediments to your locomotion. It's easy to fit through your head through something, but maybe not to drag your shoulders and hips through as well. And in that case, we often see the reduction of limbs. So here is a stick, a little squamate that lives in leaf litter, and it has reduced hands and feet. And it's, of course, relying more on that axial undulation of its trunk in order to locomote. The ultimate expression of this is limbless locomotion. And this is something that has actually evolved many times in vertebrate evolution. So everyone knows about snakes. How many of you are familiar with Cyphilians? Excellent. Okay. So Cyphilians, a living group of limbless amphibians that are either aquatic or they live underground. And we have many ancient examples too. Here's an aistopod. This is something from the early Carboniferous. So, one of the earliest tetrapods, except that in this case it's a tetrapod without hands or feet. So, real quick, how is it done? There are 4 methods. The first is simply to translate that axial undulation onto land. And that actually works surprisingly well. Here we have a snake that is growing successive waves down its body. Those waves are pushing against the surroundings, in this case not water, but solid objects on the substrate. The snake is moving forward. Right? In this case, it's vitally important that the snake be very smooth. Friction is something that really impedes locomotion across a solid substrate. And so, actually, I don't know, I knew herpetologists, they had some experience with this. I had been told by herpetologists that one of the ways that you can get a herpetologist past their fear of snakes is to get them to touch it once. Because when you just see a snake, it's all shiny, right? And if you've never encountered a snake, never had any dealings with snakes, you think, oh God, it's like, it's like this animated, nasty, intestinal animal, and it's icky, and I don't want to touch it. Get them to touch it once, they realize, no, it's dry, it's not slimy, it's just very slick, like patent leather shoes. Suddenly they realize, oh, this is not the imaginary snake animal that I'm afraid of, but a real creature that's really quite different. All right, moving on. What if there are I should just point out that you take a snake and throw it back in the water, and it becomes an axial swimmer like our eel. So there's no real change for motion. And this works fine underground, where there's solid substrate all around you. What if there are no irregularities in your solid substrate? You still have to move across. Move across the substrate as flat as it's taken. Well, in that case, you can use what's called concertina motion. What goes on there is you press down with part of your body, the front half maybe, and with the rear half, you pull it up into a series of curves. Then you press down with the rear half of your body, and you push the front half forward, and you repeat as necessary. What if the substrate is not solid at all? What if it's uncohesive particles like sandstone? No problem. It's possible effectively to walk across it by drawing successive loops of your body across it in the form of sidewinding. Here, that some snakes are actually specialized for doing that. Well, heard of the sidewinder rattles, right? And they have their equivalents in the world. And all else failing, you can walk in the ribs. Look at this. Okay, this is a Gatlon viper that is just for some reason moving in a straight line. This is particularly useful if you are moving up a tree branch because there's a bird sleep at the end of it that you want to get. You have no option for cloning or concertina motion. You just got to go in a straight line. And of course, these methods of locomotion are not mutually exclusive. You can use more than one at once. So, this has been evolved, like I said, many times in vertebrate evolution. Just a couple of examples of creatures that have either achieved it, like the aistopod or that are clearly on their way in that direction. So here we have Lissaropian, Bachytectus. This is a small, let's say, stem amniote, a creature that's on its way to becoming an amniote, but is not there yet. You saw a living example. You would probably think ecologically it's more like an amphibian. Same thing for our recovery rostrum here. And down here, our caecilians are proper loose amphibians. I'm showing you a picture here of the earliest known caecilian, Caecilian from the early Jurassic. If you know, it still has arms and legs. One here is that in order to evolve this kind of locomotion, you have to retain some capacity for undulating your vertebral column. If you don't have that, you have nothing to work with. And for that reason, we don't have limbless mammals, turtles, birds, or crocodilians. None of them really undulate their vertebral column, at least their dorsal vertebral column, as they move. No, no. Crocodilians don't, okay? Crocodilians, they play a sprawling gait. They use their tail to locomote in the water, but on land, they keep their trunks pretty much straight, okay, with relatively little flexibility. In fact, when a crocodilian wants to travel some distance, it's not just a little burst of speed, they'll pull their legs under them into what's called a semi-improved gait. We call this a high walk when you see the crocodilian. So the feet are not directly under the body, they're out to the side slightly, but it's very different from the sprawling gait of a lizard. All right. The chimps are the squamates. That's the taxonomic name for the group that includes lizards and snakes. And so limbless locomotion has evolved at least 25 times independently in this group. Here's some major examples. So snakes, of course, but we have limbless skinks, limbless anglers. You may have heard something called a glass lizard. That's an example of that. Odd burrowing types like Spanians, dynamics, and here the paleobiology is a limbless Australian gecko. So we need to stop and talk about squamates, or squama, the taxonomic group. They show up in the fossil record at the very end of the Triassic, and they're doing great today. Encompass roughly 10,000 species and have a huge range of ecological specializations, especially when you go in fossil form. So, people I know, all right, raise your hand if you've ever heard the term lizard-like used as a synonym for primitive. All right. So many places in popular literature where someone will refer to a creature like this, Limnosaurus. This is about life size, projected on the screen, by the way. This is a Permian creature that is not quite an amniote yet. It's long and slender. It has relatively small arms and legs sticking out the side. It has a long tail, but it is not lizard-like. All right. Lizards are highly derived, extremely evolved creatures with specializations that this completely lacks. And I don't know how many times I've had to explain to people in this hour, it's not a lizard. If anyone had that experience, I'm so sorry. All right. You can tell that those people have never spent any time trying to capture them, or they would know that they're completely different locomotor graphs. Okay. So what makes squamates different? What are the evolutionary advances of squamates? Now, if you're on your game, you know that this picture is not of a squamate. This is a creature called Spearheaded, the New Zealand tuatara. How many? Okay, that happened. Okay, this is vanishingly rare endangered species from New Zealand. That's going to be our basis for comparison. It is an animal that is closely related to squamates, but absolutely definitely is not a squamate itself. So let's look at it and compare it to the squamate. Here's the skull. Now, there is no region of the squamate body that we couldn't point to, and I couldn't go off talking to you about the derived features. Squamates are highly evolved in their locomotor function, right? Their pectoral girdles, for instance, are highly mobile in a way that A typical amniotes is not, with their weird, with their ability to autonomize their tail. If you've ever grabbed, you can call the tail and then come off your hand. But I'm going to focus on this skull, right? And first, a thing that is not responding. Here's the skull, Spherodon. But I'd like you to focus on this bone. That's the quadrate. The quadrate is the bone that, in most vertebrates, is the bone of the skull to which the jaw hinges, which the jaw attaches. So if you look at the jaw bone, mammals are different. Okay, forget mammals. But for non-mammalian vertebrates, the jaw basically attaches to the skull at this bone, the quadrate. And in most, the quadrate is firmly attached to the rest of the bones of the skull. And that's certainly the case with Sphenodon here. Just as long as we're on this, let me just point out, Sphenodon has heterodontition. That is to say, it has different shapes and sizes of the teeth. As you go down the tooth row, it has an extremely powerful bite. It uses its skull to bite pieces off of its prey. It does not swallow its prey whole, having been melted. Now it's like that's fun. Some roughly the same size. Tucanamus, taking it used to be in the pet trade. I don't know if they are anymore. And if we look at its quadrate, we see it's a different story altogether, right? The quadrate is this thing that looks sort of like a backwards question, right? That embayment in the rear, I'm going to use my shadow here. That embayment in the rear houses the eardrum. But the thing that's really special is that all of the jaw is still articulated quadrate. The quadrate only has a loose connection to the rest of the skull. In fact, it hinges to the skull root up here at the top by means of a synovial joint, actual joint capsule. So the quadrate is intended to rock back and forth on the rest of the skull. This gives primates significant leverage in their jaws and is the beginning of their adaptation for engulfing their prey whole and for swallowing large prey items. And it's an identification key that you want to be aware of. So that's the basics on what makes primates different. Now, what's their diversity? All right, if I were to point at different people in the room, I'm sure that you could rattle off a bunch of different primate families, right? And these families, the Linnaean families, pretty much show up in phylogenetic analyses as being monophyletic groups. So Geckota, right? The geckos, yeah, that was a Linnaean taxon. Platus get it too, all right? Scincomorpha, Anglomorpha, Iguania, and so forth pop up in phylogenetic analyses starting at the beginning in the 1980s and going up to the present day. The cladists, however, have been working on the bigger picture, how those families go together. And there's been a great deal of movement and controversy there. So I'm going to give two versions of this in this talk. The first is sort of the naive version. Right? I had a guy on my dissertation committee named Jacques Cody. He's a professor of the and his PhD dissertation in 1984 was the first ever phylogenetic analysis of the diapsid reptiles. And he came up with this dichotomy that pretty much stood the test of time. There are two groups of squamates. So if you look at me on a cladogram, right, one group is called Iguania, the other group is called Scleroglossa. So Iguania includes a whole bunch of diversity, right? Iguanas, of course, but also things like fence lizards, agamids, the horned lizards, chameleons, and a whole bunch of others. And their advanced feature, their synapoma, their shared derived feature, there are actually a bunch of them. But one that's sort of easy to wrap your brains around is they use their tongues in prey capture. And so bearded dragon, perfect good example of an iguana doing the thing that iguanians do. So I don't know what this creature gets out of this case, by the way. It must notice that they don't taste like bugs, right? But maybe not. Okay. The chance of here, of course, of chameleons who can actually project their tongues, the length of their trunk. Who's ever seen a chameleon? Oh, you'll have it. That is the amazing thing. All right. The other group is scleroglossus. Okay. So Jurassic to recent. And this is sort of the everything else. And what do we got in here? Geckos, anglomorphs, snakes, mosasaurs, canids, skinks, and others. They are also united by varieties, and that's a scaly tongue. That name scleroglossus means scaly tongue. And so their tongue, at least the posterior half, that half of the tongue is covered with scales. That pretty much negates its utility in prey capture. All right? So they use it for something else. Not all, but many of the scleroglossus actually specialize the front end of their tongue as the sense point. Okay? That is the classic forked tongue. Here you see it in the veranda, where it's sticking its tongue out, putting its tongue out, picking up chemicals that is then going to pass to a pair of vocal and nasal organs in the root of its mouth that are chemosensory organs, sort of like, you know, analogous to the sense of smell or the sense of taste. We humans don't have them, so we don't experience it directly. Now, while we're on the topic of scleroglossus, I want to talk about two groups of scleroglossus superorganisms. The first is mosasaurs, arguably the most spectacular scleroglossus. And these, all right, I'm guessing everyone in this room knows what a mosasaur is, doesn't need an introduction. That's fine. They show up in the middle of the Cretaceous, and for the second half of the Cretaceous, they are dominant apex marine predators. And then they're extinguished as the Cretaceous very extinct. Mosasaurs have an interesting place in the history of science because mosasaur, the original mosasaur, was also the first fossil reptile to be studied scientifically. That happened at the turn of the 19th century when Napoleon's army actually captured a specimen of one that was being housed in a little shrine in the town of Maastricht, Netherlands. And it was sent to Paris to the laboratory of this guy, Georges Cuvier, founder of the science of comparative anatomy, who looked at it and said, okay, this is a giant lizard. This is actually one of the major pieces of evidence in support of the idea that species could go extinct. Which, you know, in the year 1800, was a controversial notion. But Cuvier said, if these things are swimming around out there now, you would think we would have spotted one. They would be hard out. Now, Cuvier was absolutely right. And by the way, hear of dinosaurs being called terrible lizards and great fossil lizards. Now, that's hyperbole. But in the case of mosasaurs, it's literally true. These are actually great fossil lizards. And the quadrate is the proof. So here's the skull of Tylosaurus, and I've drawn a box around this question mark shape, a sort of kidney-shaped quadrate, which is sort of dangling there loosely from the rest of the skull root. That shows that this creature had exactly the kind of jaw mobility that other squamates do. And in a way, it sort of surpassed. Oh, just to point out, the quadrates of mosasaurs tend to be really robust. Why? Because remember, the quadrate is the thing that houses the eardrum. And if you're a diving reptile, you've got to reinforce the eardrum, otherwise it will burst. Other mosasaurian things. The limbs are converted into paddles. The snout is elongated. And now look at this. The jaw is divided into a front and back half by a mobile joint that's about mid-length. So whereas, you know, a typical squamate, let's say my shoulders are my jaw joint. Typical squamate could just move its jaw up and down like this, or rock its quadrates back and forth. Mosasaurs can actually do this too. Right? The jaws have elbows, right? And that enhances their capacity to engulf large prey. Moreover, mosasaurs have the teeth of their palate. Oh, and by the way, just remember, mammals are weird. We don't have teeth growing out of the roof of our mouths, but a great many vertebrates do, and squamates no exception. In the case of mosasaurs, those palatal teeth are organized in a pair of really stout rows that go, forward and back on the roof of the mouth. Now, we've been studying mosasaurs since the beginning of the 19th century, but they continue to surprise us. I want to show you some of the surprises that have come up here in the 21st century. So here is a late 20th century illustration of a mosasaur. This is a mosasaur giving birth. We don't know if they actually did. Right? This shows mosasaur giving birth. I want you to look at its tail. It is flattened from side to side, as you would expect from an aquatic lizard. But that was all speculative. No one really quite knew what the shape of a mosasaur tail was until 2013, when the remains of a specimen Prognathodon were found that had soft tissue profile. Okay, so this told us also that we had scales on this, very fine little rhomboidal shaped scales. But the big news here was that the tail wasn't just compressed, but it had a proper tail fluid, right? Vaguely analogous to that of an ichthyosaur. And knowing this about Prognathodon, we have to ask, could other mosasaurs have really been that different? All right, is this a Prognathodon feature, or is it just a mosasaurian? One thing we've learned, and this is from stable isotope analysis of its bones, is that mosasaurs apparently will warm blood. What you see here is the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 in bone tissues of a variety of creatures. So here are fish, this a particular fish, cretaceous fish. Here is a turtle. Here's a group of mosasaurs, and here's a cretaceous bird. So all fossil vertebrates roughly the same age. And what you see is that the ratio of 18 to 16 is rather high here in the cold-blooded animals, but in the bird, it's quite low, right? Where do the mosasaurs fall? They fall closer to the bird. Now, there's some variability within them, but generally speaking, it seems that mosasaurs had capacity for elevating their body temperature. That, by the way, is characteristic they share with ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, the other large reptilian predators of the Mesozoic ocean. Where do mosasaurs fit? Well, it's well established that mosasaurs are sort of the end members of an evolutionary grade group, a paraphyletic group, called it, creatures called Idealosaurs. They get that name from this creature, Idealosaurus. That is not the only one. And these are perhaps the neoplatic, not terrestrial lizards that preceded mosasaurs flight, but seem to form an anatomical continuum that links them to other squamates. They're also related to long, slender guys called Dinosaurs, which had longish necks and rather serpentine bodies. The second scleroglossal superlative is snakes. All right, and so snakes, short and cretaceous, they're still around. What makes them special? Okay, so first of all, glossal limbs. We all know that. Here are the hind limbs of, I think this is a Burmese python. Only the male has them, and this is all that's left. One little claw, so it's stuck to the end of a little femur that's embedded there in the body. More interesting, really, is that they've lost their eyelids. Their eye is protected by a transparent scale that shed when they shed their skin. The eyes themselves are interesting. They have a unique pattern of rods and cones that gives them reduced color vision compared to other squamates. And they've lost their external ear opening. They no longer have an eardrum. They pick up sound with their jaws and then transmit it to their inner ear. So, looking inside the skull of the snake, oh my God, so weird. Okay, so here's your basic comparison. Spiny-tailed iguana up at the top, a typical lizard. What you'll see is that The skull roof here extends upwards and covers up the top of the brain case, forms sort of a skull table at the top. Now look at the snake. Oh, by the way, the brain case, you see it here where my fingers are, all right? It's basically like a little trough that sits there on top of the palate, connects to the bones of the skull root, but isn't really very firmly featured. And in fact, when you prepare that specimen out, the brain case will break away, very away. Okay? You look at the snake, and what we see is that the bones of the skull root are firmly integrated with the brain case, which is turned into sort of a cylinder. It's a structural load-bearing cylinder, and it does so with the aid of a totally new bone here called the lateral sternum. So the brain case, the posterior end of the skull, to solidify, the better word, and greatly strengthen. Where all those bones of the skull root, they're most gone. But there are some interesting consequences to that. The connections between the bones of the palate, the bones of the skull root, and the brain case are loosened up, such that the palate is actually made able to move into the brain case. All right, who's ever heard the story about the fork sticking through the top of your head? Okay, here it is. So you've all seen a snake swallow a mouse, right? The head goes in first, and then the mouse just sort of slowly disappears. Well, what's going on is the snake has palatal teeth. And you can think of those as being like, if you had a fork sticking down through your head with the tines sticking out the roof of your mouth, and you were able to move those forks, so you get, the rat standing in your mouth, and then you use the tines of that fork to just walk that thing down your throat. That's basically what a snake is doing with its palate bones. Now, talk about mobility. Here's the snake's quadrant. Hinges to the jaw here. It hinges to the skull root here. But hey, wait. This skull root bone that it hinges to, the supratemporal, in a normal lizard, would be immobile. It would be fused to the rest of the skull. In snakes, it also is hinged to the rest of the skull root. So we got a 1, 2, 3 hinges imparting mobility to the jaw. Oh, and hey, speaking of the jaw, there's that mid-length hinge in the jaw, just like a mosasaur. And in case of snakes, quite often the front halves of the jaw don't even meet on the middle. Flip it over, look at the palate, and the palatal teeth are organized to south row. So here's just a little before and after. Now monitor an reticulated python, which is a primitive snake, by the way, not even a highly evolved snake. And you can see how the supratemporal goes from basically being nothing here to being this major element. You can see the changes in the proportions of the skull. And there's a display from the American Museum that sort of demonstrates how the components of the skull move with respect to one another. And this is why a snake can swallow something much larger than its head. And even that has changed. All right, I'll come back to that. Look at this. This bone is called the maxilla. It is the bone that holds most of the teeth of the upper jaw. And in the python here, it has teeth and it's sort of doing its normal thing. But now look at a biped bushmaster, that bone in red there, that's the maxilla. It is now completely mobile. It can be rocked back and forth by movement of the palate. And it only has one set of teeth in it, and those are the fangs. All those other teeth there, those are palatal teeth. So highly derived variant creatures. What was the lifestyle of the first snake? This is a problem that vexes paleontologists. And there are basically two ideas out there. The basic adaptations that make snakes so weird. One is the aquatic hypothesis, the idea that the reduction in the snake's visual system, the loss of its eardrum, are all connected to life in the ocean or life in the water. And the other is what we call the fossorial or burrowing hypothesis, the idea that the ancestral snake was moving underground, where there just wasn't much to look at, right? And where you didn't need an eardrum
to pick up airborne sound because you're getting sound straight out of the substrate. And this is a debate that has generated, dare I say it, a lot of venom, all right? Because not only is it an interesting question itself, but it interacts with other questions that Platonists get involved in, which are questions about, well, what are the closest relatives of Sphinx like? Do they support or refute any of these hypotheses? And so we have two doors. So if you are a proponent of the fossorial hypothesis, you draw comfort from the cladogram of living snakes. And this is pretty uncontroversial. The first branches off of that cladogram, the most basal members are burrowed, right? The pipe snake and the worm snake. And they are definitely primitive as snakes go. I mean, they have snake characteristics. So here's the pipe snake, Cylindrophus. And it's got that mid-joint jaw joint. It's got a mobile supratemporal, but it's not as strongly developed as you would see in other snakes. And in the case of the worm snake, oh my God. Okay, everyone knows what a snake's belly looks like with these broad rectangular scales. Worm snake doesn't have that. It's the same type of snake, scale, all the way around its bottom. And they certainly don't have the derived adaptation of this big group that are called the macrostomatic snakes. Okay, that means the big mouth snakes, the ones that are capable of doing what a Burmese python do. Well, no surprise, various cladists have suggested either skinks, which have adaptations for fossoriality, or Anthosphanians, which are completely fossorial lizards, as potential sister taxa of snakes. But that is at odds with a long-standing tradition that was actually first enunciated by Edward Coe, right? The late 19th century, the protagonist of the dinosaur war. Coe noticed similarities, and you probably did too, between snakes and mosasaurs. For example, that row of stout palatal teeth on the roof of the mouth, or the jaw joint at the mid-length of the jaw. Basically, unique features for squamates were shared by these two groups and no others. And so Coe proposed that snakes and mosasaurs were in fact very close relatives, and the group that contained the both be called Pythonomorpha. And so the Pythonomorpha hypothesis sort of goes hand in glove with the aquatic hypothesis of snake origins. And here we have aquatic mosasaur, of course, aquatic snake. And that was the state of things until the 1990s. And in the 1990s, it's like some argument just came gasoline on this by a group of publications that re-examined very primitive Cretaceous snakes that have been known for a while, but not very well studied. Pachyrhacus being sort of the real poster child, but there were some others that people looked at. By the way, in this drawing, this is Pachyrhacus. Here's a human for scale, but look, Pachyrhacus is that little thing down there. All right, so this is not, in fact, a really huge monster to even snake. All right. So these animals were interesting because, first of all, they were absolutely definitely aquatic. They were found in shallow marine deposits. The second thing was that they had small but functional hind limbs, right? A snake with legs. And so you would think that a snake with legs would be a primitive snake, right? Stands to reason. And a primitive snake that is also marine, you would think would really clinch the aquatic hypothesis. But not so fast. The opponents of this view got their heads together, and this actually happened at a convention of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, which took place in the late 1990s, where presentations were being given on the aquatic primitive snake and how it clinched the aquatic hypothesis. The specimen had been brought to the meetings. And a bunch of the opponents said, we just learned this specimen for a while and examined it, and came out with a rebuttal that basically said, what you're not noticing is that this isn't actually a primitive snake. This snake has the skeletal characteristics of a macrostomatid snake, one of those derived ones with a big mouth. And then they proceeded to enunciate their rebuttal. So, taking them at their word, we're left with something that's sort of enigmatic here. That said, our living Cretaceous marine snakes are just up here somewhere on the snake tree. And that requires us to accept that, that the hind limbs are a secondary reacquisition. Okay? That Pachyarachus secondarily re-evolved hind limbs for some unknown reason. Right? And it asks us to accept that these creatures have nothing to do with snake origins. All right? No one is really comfortable with this. I have to say that personalities were involved. Okay, there was a level of personal investment in the arguments that they made that may really have sort of cluttered the scientific process. People stepped back, they took a breather, and in the 21st century, we've seen new world. So here's Jacques Godier, I was telling you about 1984 phylogenetic analysis dissertation on my dissertation committee, and here he is wrestling the state, right? So getting it up. We talked on the issue by doing a comprehensive statistical analysis of all of Squamata. And basically, this came out in 2012. It's one of the most beautiful publications I've ever seen. It was very good. You basically threw out anyone else's reports of what the anatomy of these creatures were like. Developed, he and his team developed his own database, scored this huge phylogenetic matrix from it, and published it with copious illustrations. It is an encyclopedic guide to the phylogenetic anatomy of Squamata. A beautiful thing. And the result that he came up with basically said, okay, mosasauroids, that's mosasaurs, golicosaurs, hygialosaurs, they are kicked out of Scleroglosса. They're not actually part of Scleroglossa. They certainly don't have anything to do with the fence. Here they are, actually vanished to the base of this agave tree. Right? What about the snakes? Well, here they are with their close relatives, the burrowing Amphisbaenians and Diamanus, these elongate, limbless, burrowing lizards that are not snakes. And so he saw this sister taxon relationship between these three groups. They even claimed that they formed group 10, that means they did, and regarded this quite reasonably as strong support for the fossorial hypothesis. Here's when you say phylogenetic, I think DNA sequence are linked together. Okay. Right now, we're talking about anatomical data. Okay, so this is a rabbit hole I don't think we can get into right here, but we can discuss it later on. Basically, to do a phylogenetic analysis algorithmically, you create a big table where each line is a taxon, and each column is a particular character that is variable in its configuration. So it could be something like opposable thumbs, absent or present, right? And so they tend to be binary characteristics. Like that. So, in the case of our squamates, it could be, intramandibular jaw hinge, present or absent. And then use a computer algorithm that takes all of those characteristics, maps them onto every possible configuration of a branching phylogeny, and counts up the characteristic changes that implies, and then identifies the most parsimonious arrangement, the arrangement of the tree that invokes the fewest special assumptions, that fits Occam's razor best. And you can use DNA data for that, where instead of saying anatomical feature, present or absent, you're saying at this particular base pair position, is it A, C, G, or T, right? But it works basically the same way, but they are different classes of data and they deal with different results. All right, to move ahead. Adding color to this, we had the discovery of 2015 of a burrowing fossil snake with both fore and hind legs, a creature called Tetrapodopus, four-legged snake, right? And so that really seemed to support the fossorial hypothesis. Yet people kept publishing results supporting the iconomorpha hypothesis, the athletic hypothesis. Why wouldn't it go away? Well, the simple answer to that is that the interpretation of the skeletons of the fossils is sort of a Rorschach test. These are not beautifully prepped out things like you might see over here. These are creatures that have been crushed and two-dimensionally preserved, and we have to try to understand what we're seeing. So, for instance, here's Pachyrhacus. This element in green, this diagram, is interpreted as a jiggle bone, right? But there are others who said, no, it's ectopterygoid. The jugal is a bone of the cheek. The ectopterygoid is a bone of the palate, right? Depending on what you think you're looking at, you score that phylogenetic matrix differently, and you get a different result. It turns out you only have to change a few cells of that matrix to restore mosasaurs back to the crown of the squamate tree. All right, so this is the basic fundamental issue. So, and as of 2021, it turns out Tetrapodopus is not a snake after all. It's actually a coelenthoid. So, wah. So maybe the problem is that we're looking at the wrong kind of data, and that we ought to be doing what you suggested and looking at molecular data instead. Now, of course, you're not going to get that from a mosasaur, but you can certainly get it in a very complete form from a huge number of living taxa. And so this guy, John Williams, and his colleagues in 2012 performed a comprehensive DNA analysis of squamata. What they came up with was something new. And that was a result in which scleroglossa, and if you're alert, you've noticed I've been putting that in ironic air quotes, right? Scleroglossa disappears. Okay? Here's squamata, and the basal member of squamata is geckos, right? What happens to our iguanians? They migrate all the way up to the crown of the tree, where their sister taxon is Anguimorpha. Anguimorphs are things like monitors, Gila monsters, and glass lizards. And so now we have this new pairing. Their sister taxon is snake. Okay? So Williams et al. Called this new clade Toxicopora. That's the venom bearers. And that is because they're representatives of each of these groups that have some form of caustic saliva as a prey capture mechanism. Those of us who like morphological data, anatomical data for our agencies, were uncomfortable with this. And then Reeder et al. Came up with a combined analysis that combined the anatomical and the DNA information and got basically the same results. Only he included mosasaurs. And look where they pop up. As a sister taxon of snakes inside Toxicopora. So Pythonomorpha is back. Now, the caveat here is that these two, they went to grad school with me at the University of Texas. And they were like tweeting on the Twitter. Their best buds. We saw one of them in the room. We were going to see each other. Very smart guys. But when you see Reeder et al., Bates et al., it's really the same research. This result you're seeing. I will be happier with this result when other independent research groups start replicating. But I gotta hand it to them. They have now found not only molecular, but morphological characters that support Toxicopora. there's something about it that's kind of nuts. And that is that the hypothesis sort of straightens out a mess that the traditional phylogeny created. That is that in the traditional phylogeny, creatures were appearing in the fossil record in the wrong order. Our most basal branch out was Iguanian. The Iguanians are not the first primates to show up in the fossil record. The breeder and wings result really is much more consistent with the sequence of appearance in the fossils. And that is a totally independent test of the validity of their hypothesis, right? It's not something that comes from any phylogenetic analysis, and yet it supports their result. Like I say, so far only one research group. Wow. If you look at Wikipedia and you go to the section about phylogeny for squamates, they show you this first, right? And that's sort of an indication of the degree to which people are kind of easing towards the idea that this may really be the solution to the issue. All right. I do not know what happens to the little fossorial guys that look like snakes. Why did Gautier et al. Have them showing up as acclaimed? Maybe being fossorial just forces you to convergently evolve a bunch of similar morphologies. And so I could easily see that result being misled in that way. But the take-home message here is, this is like the 1950s science fiction show. Is this the end? Well, no, it's not. We really need to see confirmation. But we do seem to be approaching some sort of synthesis here. But don't put it past the servants to continue to deceive us. All right? And at this point, I would be happy to take your questions. My golden spike, what would make me believe this? A different research team using their own data set, and perhaps a molecular data set drawn from different examples of the various squamate families that produces a largely congruent result. Okay, Breeder and Weeds did not go and take DNA samples from 10,000 species of lizards in order to do their biology. They took representative examples of major groups. I wouldn't dare say that. I'm sure they had their reasons for choosing the ones that they did, like access and stuff, would probably be a big part of it. But at the same time, you can in principle go and where Reader and Weeds use a blue tongue stick, I'm making that up, a blue tongue stick, use some other kind of stick as your representative of the skinks. Same thing for the other major places they included. That would create an independent test. And it would be nice to see that done by people who have nothing to do with Reader. Okay? In other words, Reader and Weeds cannot help but influence each other because they are so close to profession. I have no reason to doubt their good intentions, they're honest. But when we start seeing widespread corroboration of this, that's the golden spike, except there's no one golden spike, right? It's something that proceeds incrementally as more and more analyses come in. Maybe someone's going to find something totally different. Right? And then that would open the whole issue back up. That would be an interesting thing too. It's like I say to my students, just because you have a highly resolved result doesn't mean that it's the right result. Okay, sometimes ambiguity is actually better if your alternative is a highly resolved, very specific result that just happens to be untrue. Right? So, we'll go wherever the evidence sends us. Additional fossils. All right, this is the thing. Somewhere out there really is a four-legged snake. All right. Somewhere in the Jurassic, there lived a creature that was evolving towards snakiness that still had its forelegs, right? If we could find its fossils, they would surely be revealing. Oh, and I just want to say one thing. I didn't say this early on. One of the protagonists one of the describers in back to back is a guy named Mike Caldwell. He's a Canadian and he's arguably the best working for involved in this whole issue by this guy. Long, blonde hair, sort of gives a little bit float behind him. His whole shit, he's very, very smart guy. His whole shit is he doesn't give a talk. He doesn't write a paper in which he refers to snakes. He only calls them snake lizards. And at first you have to wrap your brain around the fact he's not talking about something else. No, he's using that term in order to reinforce the fact that snakes are just a highly specialized kind of lizard. A very successful one because they're about half of lizard diversity. Okay, what else can I help you with? Yes. 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 Yes.
Could you please repeat the question? For
Okay, so
for
the
Zoom?
question is, do the earliest known mosasaurs have that hinged jaw? And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. From the very beginning, mosasaurs had the hinged jaw. What I'm trying to remember, I don't think I know this actually. So I'm not going to make it up. What I don't know is the position of the jaw in the idealosaurs, that basal paraphyletic group inside which the mosasaurs are nested. If that hinged jaw, I think I see where you're going, if that hinged jaw is actually a shared derived character with fish, you most certainly would expect them to have a good and that's something, you know, if one of you looks that up and finds out, let me know. Okay. Yes, sir. Turn that over to you.
Yes.
Hey.
Your answer is yes. The ones that I've been on the scene.
All right, and you just reminded me of an ancient exactly, by the way. So you said the word innocent. And so who's heard of paleontology? Okay. I gotta say, my professional expertise absolutely fits the patients. So I only know this by reputation. But there was a giant South American snake, not a boa, but a maxillate, which is the awful group, that the largest snake ever. But what someone recently pointed out is that at the time that it lived, as far as we know, it was the largest animal on Earth. Okay? So in the Ancient, there was this brief shiny moment when snakes were the apex animal. Thin last one. All right, Matthew, is there anything on this?
Looks like no questions coming in from Zoom.
Okay, well, so I Zoom people, I said hello, and I thank you very much for joining.
Thanks very much.
All right, well, I think